Mark chapter 3. Mark chapter 3, start reading with me in verse 13. Mark 3:13 says this, "And he went up on the mountain and called to him those whom he desired, and they came to him. And he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach, and have authority to cast out demons. He appointed the 12, Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder, Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas and James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Cananean, and Judas Iscariot who betrayed him. Then he went home, and the crowd gathered again so that they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, 'He's out of his mind.'" You'll remember that last week we began a new section in the Gospel according to Mark. You'll remember that part 2 was about opposition and controversy, and that Jesus faced opposition, and that answered the question of who would crucify and kill their Messiah, and section part 2 of Mark's Gospel answered that question, who would crucify their Messiah? And we saw that, the Pharisees would. And as we continue, we've entered a new section, and that section is dealing with the other responses that Jesus faced. He didn't just have 2 responses of discipleship and opposition, he had responses all along a spectrum. There was extreme hostility, there was extreme commitment, and there was everything in between. And so this whole section is about these different responses that Jesus received. And you'll remember with part 2 of opposition and controversy, I told you that whole section was about the way that we could apply that is that you need to know that you'll face opposition, and that with each one of those stories, there's something for you to take away about what kind of controversy you will face. And the same is true of this section, this part 3 of Mark's Gospel. There's an application intrinsic to each one of these stories, and it's for you to measure yourself against each of these responses. You'll see that there's responses of belief and commitment, and you can ask yourself, have I believed and am I committed to Jesus? There's responses of hostility and opposition, and you might ask yourself, do I believe? Am I hostile? Am I opposed? My guess is that none of you are opposed or hostile towards Jesus, but they can also help you when you discuss people who are hostile and opposed to Jesus or who don't believe in him. And so the main point of this section is for you to measure yourself and say, well, who am I in this story? Am I a disciple? Am I committed? Am I a demon who knows full well who he is, which none of you are demons, but do I know who he is, and am I still opposed? Am I willing to say that he's doing these things on the power of Satan? Do I believe that he existed at all, etc., etc.? And so specifically, as we read this morning and as we cover this morning, we see the episode of the apostles who are the most committed to him. They believe in him. And we know that their belief isn't perfect. Their understanding isn't perfect. And yet he asks them to commit to him. And so I will ask you this morning, have you committed to him? You have been called to commit to him in a different way than the 12. How have you responded? And so first of all, we will see the appointment itself. The text is going to tell us who is the one doing the appointing. We're going to see that there's some Old Testament imagery going on. We'll see the job application, kind of the job description. What is he appointing them for? And then we'll look at the 12 themselves and see who it is that he chose to be his apostles. And so look with me at the appointment in verses 13 through 15. Read with me again verses 13 through 15. It says, "He went up on the mountain and called to him those whom he desired, and they came to him. And he appointed the 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons." So that's the appointment. First of all, I want you to notice that there's Old Testament imagery going on in this appointment. And I hinted to you about this last week. Have you noticed that this story resembles something that happened in the Old Testament? You see, there's this guy being followed by thousands of people out in the wilderness and going up a mountain and commissioning 12 leaders. Does that sound familiar? That sounds like the Exodus story from the Old Testament, doesn't it? It's not exactly like the Exodus story. There are some differences. We'll see some of those differences, but there's also improvements. This is better than the Exodus. This is better than what God did with the story of Israel. He's instituting a new covenant with a new people, and he's doing it in a better way. And so the way that I suggested to you last week, that I hinted to you last week, that's better, is that God's people are no longer only defined by the borders of Israel. We saw that last week. We saw that people from Idumea and beyond the Jordan and from around Tyre and Sidon who weren't Jews were following Jesus. And so this new Exodus is filled with people who aren't just Jewish. They're not just Israelites. The next way in which this new Exodus is better is that the covenant mediator is better. What do I mean when I say that? Who's a covenant mediator? Well, Moses was the original mediator of the Old Covenant. You see, with a covenant or with an agreement, it's kind of like a contract, there are two parties who make an agreement and say, I'm committing to you, let's make this agreement, this will be our agreement. But there's a person who's kind of the go-between, and that was Moses. Moses went up the mountain to commune with God. Moses came down to commune with the people and to deliver instructions to the people. He went back to God and took their gripes to God. He came back to the people and gave God's answers to the people. He was the covenant mediator. But you'll notice, Moses was not a perfect covenant mediator. In fact, one of the problems with that covenant was that Moses was a weak, sinful, angry person just like the rest of them. And so the covenant wasn't perfect. Hebrews even tells us that. And so Moses, because he wasn't a perfect man, couldn't be a perfect covenant mediator. He couldn't be a perfect go-between between the two parties of the covenant. Hebrews actually has something to say about this. Actually, Hebrews has a lot to say about this, but I'll read a couple of sentences to you from Hebrews chapter 3. It says this, Jesus has been counted more worthy of glory than Moses. As much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant, but Christ is faithful over all God's house as a son. He likens Jesus and Moses, but he says there's some differences. First of all, Moses was like a servant. Moses was like a slave. Moses lived in the house. Moses was a steward and a manager over the things of the house. But Jesus is not just a manager and a steward. Jesus is a son. Well, what does that mean? It means that all the things aren't just under his management, they belong to him. They are his inheritance. They are his possession. And so, in the same way, Jesus is a better covenant mediator. There's much more to be said there. I'm just touching on that because there's just this imagery here briefly in Mark chapter 3. Next, notice that God is appointing 12 leaders. That is also similar to the Exodus, isn't it? It's different. Because it wasn't just 12 leaders that were appointed, it was that the people were divided up into 12 tribes, and there was a patriarch of each one of those tribes that was appointed. And so this is different. But again, I suggest to you that it's better. Next, notice not just the Exodus imagery, notice not just the echo of the Old Testament, notice also who is the one doing the choosing. Who is the one doing the appointing? It's Jesus. Jesus is the one choosing. Look at verse 13. It says, Jesus went up on the mountain and called to himself those whom he desired. Jesus himself went up. Jesus, Luke tells us, spent the entire previous night in prayer. Jesus chose those whom Jesus wanted. The emphasis is on Jesus as the agent, as the subject, as the initiator. This is about Jesus, not about these men. It is about these men secondarily, but first of all, it's about Jesus, the one choosing. This should be a comfort to us. This was an important decision to Jesus, and Luke does tell us that Jesus spent a whole night in prayer over this decision. But we need to keep it in mind that he's the one choosing, and he's the one completely in control, because we're going to see the last person that he chooses is Judas Iscariot, who would betray him. And if we don't understand that Jesus did that on purpose, then we're going to think that this was out of his control. But what we see right now is Jesus choosing those whom he wills. And whom does he will to choose? His own betrayer. You see, Jesus is setting up the dominoes right now to fall. They are beginning to fall right now. They've already been beginning to fall, as we've seen in the last section. Once we get to chapter 14, we're going to see that the dominoes continue to fall, even though the people who want to kill Jesus are the ones fumbling the ball. They say, let's not kill him during the feast. And they kill him during the feast. They seek charges and they can't find any, and yet he still gets killed. Pilate doesn't want to kill him, and yet he still gets killed. People keep fumbling the ball, and yet Jesus keeps marching towards his own execution. And the reason is this: it's because they weren't in charge of Jesus' execution. The Father was. And the Father was simply using them as pawns. He used their desires, but we need to keep this in mind, that God is completely in control of the ministry of Jesus, and as we've suggested in previous weeks, God is completely in control of every detail of all of our lives. And that applies particularly to his choosing of the 12. It's also a comfort to us that Jesus is the one choosing, because you'll notice the reason for which he chooses these men. It says he chooses simply those whom he wills, those whom he wants. He doesn't have them have a wrestling tournament to see who comes out on top. He doesn't choose beauty queens or PhD candidates. He chooses run-of-the-mill, average, forgettable guys. Jesus simply chooses those whom he wills, and as we'll see, he chooses humble vessels to do this. This is something I've suggested to you before, but God gets glory out of humble vessels. Psalm chapter 8, verses 1 and 2 say that God set his glory above the heavens, but out of the mouths of babies and infants he established strength because of his foes to still the enemy and the avenger. God uses babies and infants to stop his enemies. And you go, what does that mean? It simply means that God uses humble vessels to defeat his foes and to accomplish his will. And that's the case with these men. He chooses humble, forgettable people that we really don't know anything about. Paul said that to the Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, he says, don't you remember your calling? Consider your calling. Not many of you are wise, according to worldly standards. Not many of you were powerful. Not many of you were of noble birth. He takes these things that were esteemed in the current culture and he says, that wasn't you. God didn't choose you because the culture thought you were great. God chose you, humble vessels. It says, in fact, that God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are. God takes forgettable, humble, negligible, marginal vessels, and he uses them for his own glory. In fact, this is consistent with what we see in the Old Testament, isn't it? You'll think of the story of Gideon. Gideon was facing a multitude of multiple thousands, and he gets an army of 10,000 people, and God says, nope, you're taking 300. And you ask the question, well, why? Because God was getting glory out of the military victory that Gideon won. There was no way that 300 people would take that multitude of thousands. And so we're forced to say, well, that had to have been God. And that's consistent with Jesus choosing the apostles. We're going to see their character throughout this gospel, and we're going to go, why in the world would Jesus choose somebody like that to be the foundation of his church? But again, that's a comfort to us, isn't it? Because we're weak. We're foolish. We're sinful when we're real with ourselves. We don't always like to be real with ourselves. We like to think that we're more than we are. But the reality is, God chose you to give him glory because you couldn't take any for your own. You don't deserve any. You have to give it up to him. We are trophies of his grace and not of our own accomplishments. And that's what we see with Jesus choosing the 12. Notice, we're going to see the job description. We're going to see the purpose for Christ's choosing, and that's in verses 14 and 15. It says in verse 14, he appointed the 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. First of all, it says that he chose them so that they might be with him. You see, up to this point, Jesus is traveling around, and we're going to see him continue to travel around for the rest of his ministry. And there's a gigantic crowd of people who are probably traveling to go see him as a pilgrimage and then going home. And there are people who believe in him and they go to see him when he comes to their town, and then when he leaves, they stay at home. And they do their own job. And they continue on with life. And in some cases, that's okay. We see that with Lazarus and Mary and Martha, don't we? Anytime Jesus would go to Jerusalem, he would go stay with Lazarus and Mary and Martha. But there's no record of them going with him anywhere else. And the reality is, he doesn't call all of his disciples to follow him everywhere, but he does call these 12 to be with him, to go with him wherever he goes. It says not just that they might be with him, but it says so that he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. So that he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. In other words, he wants them to do the exact same things that he's doing. In fact, that is a word-for-word quote from chapter 1. When Jesus went on his Galilean preaching tour, it says that he went throughout all Galilee, first, preaching in their synagogues, and second, casting out demons. And here again, it says he might send them out to preach first, and second, to cast out demons. What's implied there is the ability to heal sickness. But again, he wants them to do the same things that he's doing. He wants them to do the same things that he's doing, to be his representatives, to carry his mantle, to represent him to Jews and Gentiles alike. Now, one important note that we're going to have to keep in mind for the next 2 weeks is that even though Jesus gives the apostles authority to cast out demons, they still struggle to do it. Sometimes it was easy for them to do, but there are multiple accounts of them trying to cast out demons and having a hard time with it. And so that's going to be important because the scribes are going to go, why is it so easy for you to cast out demons? So keep that in mind for the next couple of weeks. However, this is also a practical point for us. You see, if they were to go out and be his representatives, they first had to be with him. They had to follow him. They had to observe him. They had to get to know him if they were going to preach the message he wanted them to preach, if they were going to echo the behavior that he displayed, if they were going to be like him, they first needed to be with him so that they could get to know him. And that's the same for you and me. You see, we're not called to be the 12. We're not called to go on missions the way that they were, or to be the foundation of the church the way that they were. But the reality is, you have been called to a calling to follow Jesus and to be like him. And the reality is, if you are to be like him, you must first be with him. If you are to represent him, if you are to fulfill your calling, you must first make sure that you spend consistent, personal, private time with him, getting to know him. And so that's where I ask you, do you do that? Do you spend consistent, personal, private time with him in the Word and in prayer? You must. If you would be like him, you must know what he's like. And if you would know what he is like, you must be there to observe him. You must soak in his character through the Word. You must spend consistent time with him. Next, we see not just the job description, we see not just that he's choosing, we also see the names of the men whom he chooses. And so look with me at verses 16 through 19. It says, he appointed the 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. Sorry, I started in 14. In verse 16, he appointed the 12, Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder, Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas and James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus and Simon the Cananean and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now, we're going to cover some of these guys. The reality is, we don't have as much information as we would like about many of them, if any of them at all. We have a handful of stories about each of them. We have maybe 1 or 2 stories about each of them. We've got a couple of stories about James and John, and then we've got quite a bit of information about Peter. But even with Peter, we don't have as much information as we'd like. We don't know anything about his wife or his kids. But can I suggest this to you? This passage isn't about the character of these guys. This passage isn't saying that Jesus chose them because of who they were. It says he chose them because he wanted to. And the reality is, Jesus chose these men to be forgotten. We don't really know anything about them. And so the point of this passage is that the ideal disciple is an average person. This call is extended to average people, not to famous, wonderful heroes like Achilles or Alexander the Great. This call of discipleship is extended to average, forgettable people, to people who will sit on the bench, to people who will do what God calls them to do and die and be forgotten, just like the 12. That's the point. Now, first of all, let's look at the list. It says first that he appointed Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter. So Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, or Peter, as I'm going to refer to him for the rest of the time, is the first on the list, and that's really no surprise. Peter gets more attention in the New Testament than anybody besides Jesus, and arguably Paul. But it's basically Jesus and Peter and Paul. Peter's the first on every list of the 12 that's named in the New Testament, and we don't know very much about him. We know that he's from Bethsaida. We know that he was a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee. We know that he lived in Capernaum. We know that he was married. We know that he left his job to follow Jesus. That's not very much information. What we will get to know as we read the rest of the gospel is his character to a degree. And what we'll find out about Peter is that Peter was emotional and brash. Peter was a blockhead. Peter's the kind of guy who figures out that Jesus is the Christ, and then he turns around and rebukes the Christ. Like, who thought that was a good idea, rebuking the Christ after you finally figure out who he is? Peter's the kind of guy that tells Jesus, even though all of these people fall away, I will die with you. He's committed. And even when he gets to the garden, he tries to cut somebody's head off because he's so committed. But that was a bad move. And then just after that, he's on the far end of the other side of the spectrum because he runs away, and then he follows Jesus, and people say, hey, aren't you one of his disciples? And he swears and curses, I don't know who this guy is. That's emotional. He's oscillating. He's going back and forth. Peter doesn't seem very secure. Peter doesn't seem like a stable kind of a person. Peter does not seem like the kind of guy on top of which Jesus could build his church. But that's the case. Jesus names him Peter because his name means rock. And he says, I will build my church on top of the foundation of the apostles. And so the reality is, not that Jesus chose this guy because he was stable. Jesus used him after Jesus made him stable. Jesus did wonderful things with Peter. But again, Peter couldn't take any of that glory for himself because he was emotional and kind of dumb sometimes. But Jesus is glorified in people when they're emotional and kind of dumb sometimes, but they allow him to change them and use them and make them trophies of his grace. You see, anything that you do for Christ, you can't say, well, look at the things that I've done for Christ. It's no, he saved you and made you who you are to begin with. And you can't steal glory for yourself. You have to give it all over to him. And so Peter is an encouragement to us. I love Peter. Peter is probably my favorite character in the New Testament besides Jesus. Peter, I love him and I identify with him because I oscillate, because I doubt, because I sin and I fear and I say the wrong things and I don't speak when I should and I do speak when I shouldn't, just like Peter. But the encouragement for me is that God can take reckless, emotional people and use them for his purposes. And he extends that call to us, and we have to say only God can use those people the way that he does. They're not to their own credit. They're not to their own glory. And the same is true with the next names on the list. It's James and John, to whom he gave the nickname, the Sons of Thunder. What does that tell you about them? He gave them the nickname, Sons of Thunder. And we don't know exactly why he gave them the name Sons of Thunder. We have a pretty good guess at why, but we don't actually know for sure because the New Testament never explicitly tells us. But much like Peter, they're blockheads. They are brash. They're emotional. They're even presumptuous. There's a couple of stories about them in the New Testament. The first one is they see somebody else casting out demons in Jesus' name, and they don't know anything about him, and they say, Jesus, we rebuked him. And Jesus, no, why? Whoever's not against me is for me. Why did you do that? Because they were presumptuous and brash. There's another story about them that's very presumptuous. When they come to Jesus and they say, will you give us the seats of authority in your kingdom? That is a very bold and presumptuous thing to ask. And Jesus says, I don't even have the authority to give that to you. So don't ask me for that kind of stuff. And then he said, can you drink the cup that's given to me? Can you be baptized with the baptism with which I will be baptized? And they say, oh yeah, we can. But they don't actually know what it is. They go, sure, yeah, we can take whatever you give to us, but they don't know what it is because they're presumptuous and emotional and bold and brash. Some people think that James and John were Jesus' cousins, and that would make sense. why they were so presumptuous. Well, of course Jesus would use us. Of course Jesus would appoint us to the positions of authority. We're his family. We've known him since he was a little kid. But the reality is, they're presumptuous. And again, the story goes, Jesus used them for his glory. Jesus took emotional people, and here's the reason why we think that Jesus gave them the nickname Sons of Thunder. There's a village of Samaritans that rejects Jesus, and they say, can we cast down fire on them? They can't cast out a demon, but they can cast down fire. And he says, you don't know what you're talking about. And so that's why we think he gave them the nickname Sons of Thunder. But ultimately, just like Peter, Jesus transformed a couple of blockheads and used them for his purposes and for his glory. In fact, James will be the first one to face martyrdom for Jesus. John will go on to write a gospel and 3 letters in the book of Revelation. And when we read those books, we don't read a blockhead writing to us. We read a father. We read a shepherd. We read somebody who looks like Jesus because he was with Jesus, because Jesus transformed him and used him. And so again, like Peter, and the applicable invitation to us is that, like James and John and Peter, Jesus can transform emotional, sinful people and use them in a way that glorifies him. Looking at the rest of the list, I'm not going to cover really any of these people because there's not much information about them. It says Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas and James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus and Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot. And the reality is we might have one story about each one of these guys. Some of them, we're not even really sure who they were. We don't hear anything besides their first name in the New Testament. There is one story that's worth noting, and that's with Matthew the tax collector and Simon the Canaanian. You remember Matthew the tax collector had previously been aligned with Rome. Matthew the tax collector was how they got their funding because he was extorting people and making them money. Matthew the tax collector would have been despised by everybody, but especially by Simon the Canaanian. Luke tells us that Simon actually was a zealot. And that's not just a nickname for him. The zealots were actually a political party. The zealots were vehemently and violently opposed to Rome. In fact, a generation later, when the Romans fought the Jews in the Jewish wars, the zealots were the ones who fought them the most fiercely. And so the zealots who would have hated the Romans and who would have hated tax collectors more than anybody else are both called to be Jesus' disciples, and implicitly they're reconciled. And so, again, I tell you that the result of the gospel is that God reconciles us to those who were formerly our enemies. Namely, first of all, is God. And second of all, are the people who we consider our enemies, the people who we consider to be opposed to us. When we are both called to be Jesus followers, when we are both called to be a part of the same church, God reconciles us to one another. Brace yourselves. A Republican and a Democrat can both be Christians. There's some nuances that need to be explained there, but in theory, what I'm saying is that Republicans and Democrats can be reconciled to one another, even though we see that that's this hurdle that can't be gotten over. No matter who you align with, when you're called to follow Jesus, your primary loyalty is to him, and it overcomes all other barriers that you might have to anybody else. Again, I'll remind you that lastly, we see that Jesus chose Judas, who was his own betrayer, and Jesus sets the dominoes falling for his own execution. But what's the point? Why do we have this list of names and nothing about them? Because the New Testament isn't about them. Because Christianity is not about them. Christianity is about Jesus. The New Testament is about Jesus. And when you are purchased and called to be a member of the church, when you are called to follow him, you are called to give the spotlight to someone else. Let me ask you this. How many church history figures can you name? How many people from the history of the church do you know what their name is? You might know Augustine, you might know Luther, you might know a couple of people. And I'm not shaming you by not knowing much about church history. I'm simply saying this. No matter who the Christians were who have been carrying the word for all these generations, guess what? We're here. The church is continuing. And it's not because people throughout church history have been saying, look at me. It's because they've been fulfilling the Great Commission. It's because they've been sharing the gospel. Don't go to people and say, look at me. If you join the church, you can be like me. The church isn't about you. The church isn't about me or about any of us. And the reality is, when Jesus calls us to be his disciples, he calls us to live a life that is to be forgotten, and we might die and nobody will never know who we were. Imagine that. The 12, whom he used as the foundation of the church, and we don't know who they are. Because the gospel's not about them. And so again, this invitation is extended to you. These are men who believed in him. These are men who committed to being with him and to representing him. Will you believe in him? Will you commit to him? Will you follow him and represent him? Will you preach the gospel? Will you give the spotlight to someone else? Will you sit on the bench? Are you willing to be forgotten? Because again, the gospel is not about you. If you already are a believer, are you living a lifestyle that's consistent with this calling? To give the spotlight to somebody else? To preach a gospel that doesn't glorify you? To die and be forgotten in history, just like most of the rest of the people in the church? Who are you seeking to give glory to as being a Christian? Jesus calls you to follow him, whether or not your identity is to be remembered. Amen? Let's pray.